So we're moving on to our next plenary, and not so much disillusioned students as optimistic old ones. Well, first we've got a joint facilitators for this session. Dr. John Barry, who we've heard about many times, is Professor of Green Policy, Green Political Economy and co-director of the Centre for Sustainability, Equality and Climate Action. No wonder nothing ever gets done. By the time you got your titles out, everybody's exhausted. That's at Queen's University, Belfast. You. How many Northerners have we in today? You. I love it here. I said, it's so refreshing to be in Dublin, where people are generally more optimistic. Northern Ireland is categorised by people being so negative, isn't it? Like, if there is a sunny, you say to somebody in the north, lovely day, isn't it? And they go, it's to turn bad by the weekend. I cannot wait. This is true. Years ago, I was in a taxi and I said to the taxi driver, did you hear the news? Liam Neeson won an Oscar. You know what the taxi driver said? I'll not get it next year, but... And if anybody does well in Northern Ireland, there's always somebody in the pub afterwards who'll say, him, I knew him at school, he was a dick. Whereas down here, you're almost verging on the American with your enthusiasm levels. It's wonderful. Anyway, but it'll not last. When we get to United Ireland, we'll learn you how to be. You'll be just as depressed as the rest of us. So John is co-chairing this session with Dr. Sharae Deckard, who's Associate Professor in World Literature at UCD. Her research interests intersect environmental criticism, energy humanities, and world ecology approaches to literature, ecology, and culture. She has recently, in March of this year, published a book called Tracking Capital, World Systems, World Ecology, World Culture. We welcome both of them. They'll introduce the other speakers, so please give them a big round of applause.
That's great, Nuala. Modern Mike Galer, Sean the Barra is Anam Dum, is us Ulskul Dale Ferisha, no Ulskul the Manrina Dale Ferisha, and to officer I'm a beg on Shaw. So my name is John Barry. I'm from University College Belfast, or Queen's University Belfast, and I'm delighted to be with you here today. And everything I've just said raises the issues of this session. The fact that I've used a few words of Gaelga, the fact that I've questioned my university's name of Queen's University Belfast, and indeed the Z in the title might come in terms of an issue. So the year is 1656, and in the wake of Cromwell's suppression of the Irish Rebellion, an ambitious colonial official, William, later to be Sir William Petty, is tasked with conducting a survey of the value of confiscated Irish lands, the Down Survey as it's called. And it's acknowledged as the first systematic measurement of the value of an economy, what we now call GDP, or gross domestic product, economic growth, the subject of our conference. And Petty is credited as one of the originators of macroeconomics. He's the first person to use the word economics in the English language. But just as Marx noted the violence through which capitalism emerged into the world, famously saying capital emerges from head to toe, from every pore in blood and dirt, we have to recognize that economic growth is not birthed innocently into the world. Its origins are in expropriation, colonial violence, and exploitation. And as an aside, in response to the cold calculating logic of Sir William Petty in the 17th century, Sir Jonathan Swift penned his modest proposal as the economic growth strategy of Ireland of the poor Irish selling their babies for the rich English to eat. Fast forward to the 1930s, and a bunch of white guys from Europe and North America are designing what we now call gross domestic product. They made the completely arbitrary decision to exclude the unpaid work of women and to only include all monetized exchanges, just systematically excluding most of the economies in the global south, and indeed discriminating against women and relegating care as a non-economic matter. And in the post-war period, economic growth becomes a key issue in the battleground of the hearts and minds between capitalism and communism in the Cold War, with organizations such as the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, indeed the EEC, what we now would see as the European Union, set up as ways of training and spreading the gospel of growth so that the elites from America to Ireland could demonstrate to their population that the superiority of liberal capitalism over communism. And this is an example, in a way, if you fast forward again to the 1960s, what the UN called the decade of development, whereby development was defined as economic growth. And at this period, we have decolonizing societies becoming independent, and they are now judged by how developed, undeveloped, or developing they are, by how close they now are to their former colonizers. This is a real example of what Linda Doyle mentioned yesterday of epistemic injustice, or what Jenny Stevens was talking about as something that we need to unlearn. It seems to me that in this naming, this domination of orthodox economics, this colonizing sense in which it captures our imaginary, it's akin to what Adam, in the naming of the creatures that God brings him, as this absolute domination in naming something, judging something. And in a way, macroeconomics, or orthodox economics as it's now known, never has so powerful an idea gripped a population that serves the interests of so few and that is sustainable for so short a time. Growth has become a common sense. Growth is something that everybody thinks we need for an economy to be judged by. And from its origins in Ireland, we can see that from the boardroom to the barroom, from the seminar to the Sunday papers, growth is what we're supposed to be judging our economies by. And in this way, this colonizing feature of economic growth, going back to Cromwellian Ireland, continues to this day. It's effectively colonizing our imaginaries. And so to conclude, the reason for the fifth province to be included in the title of this session is in reference to the fact that Ireland has 4 provinces, with Tara usually seen as the political centre, but another centre was the fifth province, the realm of creativity and possibility. And so what we'd like to do in this session is to explore how and in what ways the fifth province, this uniquely Irish way of stepping out from how the world is to try and imagine how the world could be, how can we rethink growth and indeed rethink economics? Or if not that, let's take seriously Julia Steinberger's view yesterday of abandoning growth. And let's give growth a good Irish wake, thank it for its services, give it a decent burial, and move the feck on to something better. So in a way, this is a bookending of growth, beginning in Ireland and perhaps having its resting place here as well. And with that, I'd like to welcome my co-facilitator, Dr. Sharae Deckard, onto the stage.
You hear me better? Oh, that's better. Now you can hear it better. Wave at me if I get blurry and I will try to correct. Okay, so thanks, John. You've just given us a kind of overview of the ways in which Ireland has historically functioned from the early modern period as a kind of laboratory for testing methods of extractivism, of enclosure, of plantation, into the 19th century, where the grazier economy kind of doubled down on creating asymmetric dependencies, and into the neoliberal era, where Ireland has continue to function as a kind of laboratory for neoliberal methods of speculation, privatization, enclosure, export monoculture. So we're really kind of asking now on this session, how could Ireland instead not be a lab for these kind of extractive forms that are always tied to perpetual growth, but rather for alternative forms of political economy and ecology that are centered on what degrowth thinkers call abundance, both understood as social abundance, but also ecological diversity. Abundance, not retraction, not recession, but abundance rather than economic growth as defined by GDP. I've been currently investigating some of these questions myself on a grant called Cultural Imaginaries of Just Transitions at UCD. a project that explores how our society might conceptualize critically and culturally post-fossil fuel and post-growth futures, though we argue that these are not just future matters, as the students were reminding us earlier, that we can already see direct actions in grassroots movements, whether it's anti-fracking movements or anti-water privatization movements, or even the movement for affordable housing. These are already environmental actions that are happening here in which we might see the seeds of some of the futures that we need to see. While energy sources like solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal power, as I'm sure you've heard yesterday, are often touted as the kind of technological solutions to climate change, our project is very sort of emphatic that we must be wary of any techno-utopianism being ascribed to renewables that's not rooted in social justice. We know that green energy cannot on its own provoke the system changes required to reduce global carbon emissions and stop capital's voracious drive for perpetual growth. It's not enough to think we can just replace oil with wind or solar and continue to imagine business as usual, growth just with a different energy source enabling it. As feminist energy humanities critic Sheena Wilson states, we need to fundamentally transform our imaginaries of who we are in relationship to this planet and what futures are possible. In the case of Ireland, we might think of the fact that any imagination to transition to different energy and food systems, forms of forestry and agriculture, or better kinds of built environments, transport infrastructures, health and education systems, must all therefore also seek to achieve liberation and to reverse the deep inequities caused by colonialism and the capitalist imposition of underdevelopment. In the case of Ireland, this means looking both at conditions across the whole of the island, but also the ways in which our energy and food regimes are bound up with commodity frontiers across the world, including sites of extraction in the global south. Any imagination of a post-growth society must call for a rethinking of the processes imminent to capitalist growth. This might mean disaccumulation, decarbonization, decommodification, and decolonization. And it must be linked to politics of social and environmental justice that will often necessitate redistribution, reparation, and restoration. So here to talk a little bit more about what some of those things might look like, I'd like to introduce some of our speakers. So first of all, Dr. Mark Garavan, if you can come up to the top, who is a senior lecturer in the Atlantic Technological University at Mayo, where he teaches primarily on the Applied Social Care Program. Sinead Mercier, who I believe might be running late. I'm not sure if she's here. Oh, no, she's there. Hooray. He was a law lecturer, campaigner, and researcher with the Property and Justice Project at the Sutherland School of Law, UCD, and Amy Strecker, who is an associate professor at the Sutherland School of Law as well.
So, could I begin by perhaps inviting Amy to reflect upon what you've just heard, the conference, or indeed the title, and what's your view on
What's my view on the Z? I wasn't expecting that. I know why it's there for the spelling reason, because of the connotations of the S. But what do I think of the opening comments? I think they contextualize the session very nicely and place the session in the context of colonial history and the origins of the concept of property, and particularly the legal interpretation of property. And I think that's the first comment I'd like to make, and it relates to some of the things that Anne Petitfort was speaking about yesterday, and also David Bollier in relation to the commons, that underpinning many of the problems that we have been discussing here, especially the international economic order, which facilitates growth as it's unexamined at the moment. Underpinning that is actually property rights. Property rights considered as investors' rights, considered as abstract rights in assets over substantive lived-in, more place-based understandings and relationships between people and places and things that matter to them. But also the idea of land and the earth as property, and that can be commodified. And I think that's an obvious one. So I would say the social imaginary is closely connected to the legal imaginary, probably more so than we might realize or admit. And that doing economics in the fifth province might also mean engaging with the law, both as root cause and facilitator of extractive growth, but also as a site of practice. And this is probably the lesser known dimension of law, as particularly international law, which would seem to be contradictory, but there is that flip side. Most of the negative consequences come from international economic law, but there's a whole area of international law that arises out of grassroots collective organizing that relates to environmental democracy, like the Aarhus Convention or the European Landscape Convention, and non-binding instruments like the UN Declaration on the Rights of the Peasants, or the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And these all came about from the bottom-up processes to contest these overwhelmingly negative forces in international economic law. And of course, they're not breaking into that mold yet, but I think they show that the law itself can be a site of collective action. That's just the first point, and maybe I'll pass on to someone else.
Yes, the law is not just an ass.
No.
Mark.
Thanks very much, John. It's good to know, after all the many references to John Barry yesterday, that he's an actually existing human person. As we were beginning to think, was he a citation that was drawn out for kind of status enhancement by people? I think I want to move away slightly from the rational, if that's okay. I think when we're looking at the imaginary, we underestimate that. And I think to decommission the imaginary is not done through the mind. It needs a kind of new enchantment and a new type of conference. If you start with what you started with, the notion of the fifth province, just think about that as an idea. There was physically and geographically no fifth province. Now, in the Irish language, a province is a cuiga, so it's a fifth. So it implies there must be another. Where is it? It seems to operate at the realm of imagination or at the realm of the spiritual. And if you have that as an idea, that that's an existing reality, that changes the framework quite significantly. So don't underestimate the potency of the imagination or of the imaginary. In our culture, we are gripped by a metaphor and a set of ideas that are incredibly compelling. People here, it's the easiest game, if you're a sociologist, is to attack neoliberalism. It's a slam dunk. It's easy to do it. Because as you describe it, it's an odious system. But if it's so odious, how is it functioning? Because it doesn't appeal only to the material. I think you have to think about it. It appeals at a much deeper level to things that actually, if I were to push you, you would all agree with. So it's very easy to say we want to end it, but let's just think of some aspects of it. Individual freedom. That's a pretty neat idea, which we like. The importance of human desire as a driving engine for economic activity. I want something, I can get it. Even yesterday, most of the people, when I looked around, are on their mobile phones. It's a compelling desire object, channeling more desires to us. And behind all of that is an even deeper kind of superego, the superego injunction to be happy. Neoliberalism delivers happiness as it's constructed for them, happiness. And I'm intrigued by this potency, because I think that's extremely difficult to change. That's why I want to use language that subverts the rational, like the language of enchantment, how to move away from it when the alternative is not obviously compelling. So I like to focus in on the notion of care as one thing that might connect us back to a much deeper sense of human root. And I know care came up yesterday quite a few times as a constituent of a new type of economy. Think of the power of the metaphor growth. By the way, I will stop in 5 minutes for fear you think I'm just taking breath and about to launch into it. I'm quite good at ending, don't worry. The notion of growth is a metaphor. Now, some growth is good, some growth is bad. To just decide that we're against growth, I mean, again, this just won't communicate. It's not a strong enough enchantment, because we want some things to grow. We want care to grow. We live in a very careless world. Most human beings do not experience a lot of care. The planet doesn't experience a lot of care. There's a lot of carelessness, and there's a lot of suffering. And the irony of, and one of the things is part of our enchantment into neoliberalism is we don't like suffering. I mean, you could refashion the modern project as an attempt to eradicate suffering. And we use technology to do it. In the last few decades, we've used pastiche forms of kind of New Age, Eastern mysticism to kind of get our minds to drift away from the grimness of physical reality. And so we're constantly attempting to move away from suffering. So here's the enchantment, the thing that's quite challenging. We probably need to move towards suffering as an endemic feature of what it is to be human. Because the irony is, it is suffering that elicits care as a response. Care is a response to suffering. And so here's a new language that's not very attractive. In place of desire, in place of freedom, how do we bring about a new language of limit, a language of sacrifice? Because care, as any parent, once you have a baby, you're sacrificing sleep, you're sacrificing your autonomy. I mean, we all know this, it's the human experience. Care doesn't come without sacrifice. How are we going to speak about sacrifice in the modern world? Because if we're talking about degrowing, we're going to have to fashion a new imaginary, a new fifth province, a new set of values that lure us happily towards a new vision of what it is to be human. I think there'll be pull and pull factors. I think the students earlier pointed to the lostness of our current generation. I see students, they're very lost because the old story, the neoliberal story, is not working. They're not getting the happiness. So the thing it promises is not being delivered. Now, I have some practical suggestions, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Mark. Well, Sinead, as a new mother, how are you finding the sacrifice of parenthood?
Yes, I'm doing this on 1 hour sleep. So I was like, but yeah, thank you very much, Mark and Amy and Sharae and John. The really brilliant contextualization. And I suppose to follow on from what you're saying, Mark, I suppose in a way, when we think about this imaginary and what should our imaginary be and how do we create it, I learned of the fifth province from Sandy Dunlop, a brilliant who runs the Bard School on Clare Island, and he talked about this idea that it was a relatively non-hierarchical space where chieftains could come together to reimagine the process or the purpose and future of Ireland. And I suppose what I've learned from Amy's project as well, and particularly Amanda Bayer and Amy's work on landscape, is how do we treat places and how does decolonization actually manifest itself in how we treat space, and how do we give place its due space within the law or within politics. And one thing that I think about often in Ireland is this fifth province and the roads that lead to the fifth province. And you have the Hill of Tara, for example, in Meath, which might have been the site of it, and it was bisected by a massive motorway project, which Amy has written quite an awful lot about. And motorway projects in particular, kind of represented this new era of Irishness, this way that we were throwing off the shackles of the past, and a lot of them were funded by EU funding as well, which Amy again has written on. And as well, Cork Street and the Liberties is an example of one of the royal roads of Tara. It leads all the way to that space, to that fifth province. And if we see that place and how it's been treated at the moment as an example of how our imaginary is being enclosed, we can see that it's now lined with student housing developments. It's also, being subject to increasing, displacement of the local community there, the Liberties community. As a cultural heritage kind of chair of Antashka, we recently put in a submission, myself, Amy, and Mark Clinton, on a grotto, a Marian grotto, that's now going to be overlooked by 2 massive 8-story hotels. So these kind of traditional ways of Irish culture, or what these spaces might represent, are being increasingly enclosed. And to on your point of care, something I find very interesting about those student housing developments, and again how spatially they represent a process of colonization, is that they are not built for families. They are not built for future. They are built for a class of worker who will be transplanted again, which is a feature of colonialism, from indentured servants to slavery. The transplantation importation and transportation of labor across the globe, and the renting and removing of communities from their place and from places that they can interact with in a meaningful way. And even if they rebuild that, for it then to be destroyed because of lack of property rights. But those student housing developments for me represent a vision of growth that does not envision the growth of children or the growth of communities or the growth of a social imaginary that is inclusive or caring. It sees itself as one that, you know, is living day to day, hand to mouth, paying all your money to rent, removing yourself or not engaging yourself with the local community. You know, there's even a poster out on Cork Street outside one of those student housing developments that says, "Eat your rent." You know, but so that's when we think about how place today and how we treat these places and spaces, and how they represent how colonization is still continuing. I really see that as kind of very present in my mind, and something you've written about as well, Mark. You know, the communities in the Gaeltacht area of Rostuach and Rossport and Shell as well, those were held up as kind of, you know, the pure Irishness, the kind of representation of, you know, what the country should aim to be by De Valera and others. And yet when it came to fossil fuel projects, when it came to, you know, fossil fuel development or neoliberal kind of or capitalist forms of development, they were immediately cast aside, which I think contributed so much to the anger in the area, coming from Onkeharua particularly. So I suppose, how do we move forward, and how do we think about rethinking growth? And something I often think about is a brilliant essay by Meehan Christ, which says, is it okay to have a child in a climate crisis? And something that you often get, that kind of thankfully stopped since repeal and so on, but you used to get the odd owl fella down the back of a conference like this, and they would stand up and say, overpopulation is a problem. And all the women in the room would be like, oh, my womb. I am the problem. And I think she really powerfully makes the point, you know, when we talk about sacrifice, when we talk about, you know, what type of world we're, you know, where we have to make cuts or recessions and so on, why is it that we implement austerity on family or on care work or on communities and not on fossil fuel projects, or not on data centers, or not on kind of needlessly knocking and rebuilding buildings that could easily just be rehabilitated or reused? And those are kind of things that they're those things that I think about, and that I would, in terms of reimagining the imaginary, what would it be to give Cork Street or the Liberties its due place in society, and not what would it be to build a solidarity with from those places, from this Irishness, with other communities as well, rather than treating, as Michelle Russell, my friend, said, treating Ireland as a manic pixie girl of whiteness, that we're that we're colonized, but we're not going to be solidaristic with other communities. So how can we internationalize what we're doing as well?
Thank you. I want to ask you all just one more question and I'll hand over to Sharae. I mean, it seems to me that particularly as academics, we are primed to be critical. We're primed to find the negative. I think often we could be the first species, or certainly academics, to accurately document our own demise, the kind of the easy sociological, you know, critique of neoliberalism. So in a more reconstructive vein, some of you touched upon this. So if we are coming up with a new economics coming from the fifth province, what are the elements of it, practically or conceptually? So, Amy.
Practically, I think it's incumbent on us as academics and as teachers and writers and researchers. I think it's incumbent on us to engage as much as we can, time permitting, you know, alongside family constraints. But I think that I think it's about enacting democracy. That's what Julia Steinberger talks about. And what does that look like? you know, there is maybe a disaffection amongst people, you know, feeling that it's either compliance or resistance, and that participation is so limited. And I know right now, as we speak, we have the Planning and Development Bill, which is doing that very thing. You know, it's been paused now for the summer, but actually that walks back some of the democratic rights that people have in relation to the planning process. So access to environmental information, access, public participation, and access to justice. And they're fundamental for any democracy. So I think practically in the short term, we have international legal commitments under environmental law, for example, under human rights law, and some cultural heritage norms. But the problem is they're not being implemented, and they're being walked back by the state because of fears. Maybe some of them are understandable, because there's fears of, you know, lack of housing and all of those things. But as we know, these are all misplaced, because they're focusing too much on the market as a solution rather than actually revisiting what we have. So I think there's short-term and I think there's long-term practical measures. I think short-term, it's about engaging as much as we can, those of us who can engage, and lobbying to make sure that we fulfill some of our already existing commitments. We don't even have to look to new norms or anything. We actually have existing norms. They're just not being implemented, because there are other lobbies and they're more powerful. And I think that's one of the things we lack. It's not this normative structure, which sometimes has often has much more moral authority and more imagination. I mean, there's a lot of law out there that actually recognizes the spiritual and cultural and social and environmental value attached to land and to landscape, but it's overlooked, and there's a reason for that. We don't have the same level of dissemination, think tanks, lobbying, and so on, that the actors supporting the financial elements, the financialization of the law do. So again, it's about who's implementing the law, you know? So, and I think as soon as we need to start talking about all of these other norms as law, because often we don't talk about them as law, and there's this perception that the law is terrible. It is mostly terrible, but there is also this other side of it that can be used to counter that. And actually recently at UCD Law School, we had the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, recently appointed, Michael O'Flaherty, talk about his mandate, and he said we need to start talking about human rights as law, because what's happening is, even in the academy, you have a lot of discussion on the hierarchy of rights and what's a right and what's binding and what's not binding. That's not helpful. You know, the fact of the matter is we have all of these more enlightened, more imaginative, socially imaginative norms, but which actually are the result of grassroots organizing and collective organizing, and they made it all the way up to being adopted at international level. So there's a consensus there. So we need to start using those as a reference point, and using those and start talking about them as law, because the way in which property is being interpreted and the way in which it inoculates and encases the accumulation in global finance and capital, that is actually not inevitable, it's not natural, and it's again linked back to the shift in the idea of property during the 17th century. The original meaning of property was much more related to identity, propre, one's own, particular to, characteristic of, and actually that was the original meaning. It was about the mutual identification between the owner and the owned. And the second meaning was about possession, owning something. And that second meaning came to the fore during the 17th century, coincidentally enough. And that second meaning, which isn't inevitable or logical if we think about it. So if we want to start talking about things of rationality and pragmatism, it's not rational to think of property in these terms. It's actually destroying the planet, and it's destroying ourselves in the process. So we need to start turning it on its head and analysing for what it is. And just one more thing, sorry, is that already you do see certain judges, ideally you don't want to get to that point that you have to challenge something before a court of law, because not everyone has resources to do that. But there is a certain amount of judicial activism already reinterpreting what the right to property means. And you can see that in the Inter-American Court and Commission of Human Rights, where the court and the Commission have interpreted the right to property, even in the absence of title, so nothing to do with ownership, but to connote customary relationships with land, or spiritual and cultural relationships with land. And mostly that's in the case of Indigenous peoples, but it's being slowly broadened out to other communities as well. So, you know, why can't we have a more emancipatory conceptualization of property, You know what I mean? It doesn't have to be about a cultural exception, and that comes back to the notion of place and the notion of landscape and the fifth province. So if we conceive of the fifth province, landscape in a way is a fifth province. It's the physical space that we share. It's the space that we share, and it's not proprietary.
Talk of activism and emancipation reminds you of what Malcolm X once said: "We're not outnumbered, we're out-organised." Mark.
Thanks. I'm tempted to use a very provocative response. What do we need to do? We need to repent. In the true sense of the word, metanoia, the turning around of our mind from facing in one direction to facing in another direction. That notion of metanos. What is our mind attuning into? So how do we escape? If you think of economics, economics is fine, except strangely it's embedded within it an assumption about what it is to be human. As economics predicates itself on the utility maximizing, self-interested, rational consumer. So it says, given that, economics now works. But it's quite a significant given. I've never met a self-interested, rational human being. Literally, I've met loads of self-interested human beings, but they're not quite rational. And I have met some rational human beings, but they tend not to be self-interested. I've never met one that is all of that. It's a strange kind of a creature, invented out of our imagination. But the power of the imaginary is once you have it invented, people start thinking this is how one ought to be. So this is why I think care is a way back. I think care gives us a compelling counterweight from the careless world. And if you think of the work of care, there's the work of the non-human carers, all of the ecological systems, all of the fantastic reproduction of life that's going on all around us. That's the work of care. Human care, we just don't see it. As John said, when GDP was invented, anything that's non-monetized is not measured. So all of that work of care becomes increasingly invisible and increasingly marginalized. And primarily this is the work of women, of course, and is completely rendered invisible and of low status. We've got to recover care as the fundamental task of what it is to be human. And so there are those constituents of a culture of care which we will need to rediscover. The commons, somebody mentioned the commons yesterday, which is all that non-monetized work of love, labor of love, which we do, which we don't see. We take it as a given until it's increasingly commodified in capitalism and rendered something horrible. We need to decommodify it and recover it. We need to recover families, which we've been waging war on for decades. And because it's got caught up in our cultural wars and people scream, but just families in whatever form they take, the nurturing of children, the adult cooperation around looking after people, looking after older people and listening to older people, all of this wonderful work, we've got to revalue it again and support it. And this is why I think something like a guaranteed basic income is a fundamental requirement in order to give an income, given that that's what one needs to function in our society, to people who are not, they're working, but they're not in labor, in paid labor. There's a key distinction. Everyone is working, but not everyone is getting paid for it. We heard from the students earlier, guaranteed basic income would solve huge numbers of problems. And we definitely need a spiritual recovery. I think there's no way around that. We have so materialized our perception of reality and so limited it to a material level that we are not connected anymore with each other or with the broader functioning of the cosmos within which we function. If we could recover a notion of a cosmos with a caring being as its beginning and end, think of that as a conceptual switch. And I'm not making a religious point, just as an imaginary. What that would do to us in terms of its reframing of the meaning even of human existence, which we have lost completely. It is a tragedy that we live in. And hence, we are in a careless reality.
Thanks, Mark. Your talk there of this kind of mythical homo economicus, the vision of the human being in economics, reminds me of somebody, I forget who said, that if you take the axiomatic assumptions of mainstream neoclassical economics, they accurately describe the biology of a unicorn. Wonderful, eloquent, but feck all use to us who live in the real world. Sinead.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Mark. I should add, I see Mary Murphy in the back here, but just to add to, universal basic income, but also universal basic services. And as someone who's been through the COOM, I can tell you that income would have made no damn difference. The place is held together with masking tape and brilliant frontline staff. So, investing in services as much, and the healthcare service, would be, a part of that labour of love you talk about, Mark, for sure. And I suppose in terms of universities and, the role that they play, and again, this idea of spiritual recovery, but also kind of like, what would it be to build an embodied rationality to, in your work as in the university, to give yourself wholly, not to the work, not to overwork oneself or, to be a workaholic, but to give yourself wholly to the idea that what you are doing or what you're contributing to is part of that labour of love project. And, we talk about it's very positive to have a separation of work and life and work-life balance. But what if the work that you are doing is fundamentally quite toxic to life itself? And, something I think about often is, you meet wonderful people and they're wonderful carers, wonderful parents, wonderful friends and colleagues. But I suppose, what would it be to take kind of a step to kind of say, well, how can we address this work? How can our universities, for example, stop involving themselves in fossil fuel projects, to not just kind of talk about keep cups, to not just talk about cycling to work or bike to work schemes, but, actively target and divest itself from, not only, the fantastic campaign in UCD about Palestine, but also, we have projects in UCD that are working with London Mining, with Black Angel Mining, with the Petroleum Infrastructure Programme, and also Rio Tinto, all of which have massive involvement in mining for fossil fuels in the Arctic. They're currently carving up areas of the Arctic for themselves in order to mine for fossil fuels. This is recorded out in the public domain, and yet UCD is working with these kind of companies and these projects, while also talking about keep cups, bike to work, green, climate action. And I think this is something, this cognitive dissonance, this refusal to give oneself wholly, or to give the university wholly over to one line of thinking that is like an embracing of life, is something we really, really do need to address and target. And yeah, it's not much point in talking one way.
I think we should hand over to some questions from the floor, if there are questions. So I'll take the one at the back first, yeah.
Get your steps in, Nuala. Get your steps in.
Oh, yeah. Hold on. Where is it?
Right down the back.
Right. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate the discussions on the importance of place, spirituality, and the field of care. I'm a student from the Global South, so I have a very context-specific question. That's context-specific to Ireland, actually, so it's not too far out. I'm doing my master placement at a corporate consultancy firm. And so I understand the importance of place, but then we're part of a group that is channeling many millions of euros that are set aside by the Irish government to help corporations be more sustainable. So we're going in and we're helping people and organizations develop sustainability strategies. But then the starting points are carbon emissions and energy usage. So we go in with engineers and we say, okay, this is how you're going to reduce your emission, and this is how you're going to be more efficient in terms of energy usage. But then I'm like, okay, where do I go in with this, this talk about spirit and place, about community, without being, I guess, accused of just making out of loan the concept of stakeholder engagement, because that's so far how I imagine my entry point into bringing this new social imaginary concept into practice. So I guess that's the conundrum I'm facing, and I'm hoping to hear insights from the panel, please. Thank you.
No, Mark, maybe giving you mention spirituality. You ready?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not sure I have enough wisdom to answer the question. I think, genuinely, I think the carb gas issue you've mentioned, and I'm kind of familiar with that, and it always struck me as one of the features of that is the narrowness within which the decision-making discourses were. They were constantly confined in the way that I think you're perhaps implying. They were confined to criteria of relevance to various determining bodies. But all the things that were actually of importance to local people were in principle excluded. So I acted as a spokesperson during that campaign for a period of time, and so I was in the fulcrum of trying to mediate between what I knew the community's view to be and what could then be said meaningfully to wider publics. So the issue in those local disputes becomes, what is the meaning of place? And if you translate that into environmental terms, that makes sense. People like me, sociologists, love this because we think that's an environmental issue, so we can understand it. Or you could make it a question of health or safety. But that was never what was actually animating local people's concerns. And what was couldn't be translated into a discourse that made sense. It had to do with their sense of the meaning of place. And included in stakeholders weren't just a question of the immediate community, they were their ancestors. And they were also their descendants. And they were also their sense of memories and entities embedded within place that you can still see captured in Irish place names, which are very intimate and very precise and very localized to square meters, less even, you know, an intimate landscape that carries a narrative for people. And in that narrative, which can be very ancient and quite contemporary, intrusions of large industrial projects simply don't make sense within that narrative. It's seen as a violation and as an act of violence on a landscape. How do you go on prime time where you have 90-second sound bites with Miriam O'Callaghan and an adversarial setup, which you're always put into an adversarial setup, and say that in a way that makes sense? It's almost impossible. So this is part of the huge contraction that we're in. And if we don't open up, and we're using for now the metaphor of the fifth province, we're too contracted in our conceptual decision making.
There's a lot of questions coming up now.
Yeah.
Can I ask? Yours is answered. Oh, sorry.
Hold on now, hold on. Don't shouting in the wind if nobody can hear you.
I swear there's a question. So thank you for that question and thank you to the panel. So I'll be speaking on a panel later about business and I'll be speaking directly to that. And I had a question about modelling leadership because I think this is the brass tacks it comes down to. We're in this point of complete transformation and the government's programmes, are you delivering CSRD perhaps? Yeah, okay. So I know this world and I know this world. And it's about bridging both of them. And it requires a lot of courage to stand in a business space and talk about the fifth province. But unless we're doing that, we're failing the transformation we need in this time. Mm-hmm. So the question, if I could build on that, is about modelling leadership in the social imaginary and bringing the fifth province more centrally to how we even, stand in meetings and decolonize our spaces. And what might you share with us in this moment that we can take away and act on that?
Well, first of all, go follow me on LinkedIn and you'll see exactly what you should be doing. Perhaps Sinead and then.
I'll just give a quick shout out. There's a brilliant academic, Ali Sheridan, who's doing work on interviewing CSR, Ireland actually, from DCU's brilliant climate change policy masters. Trinity has a great one, sustainability as well, and in business too. The MSc here in sustainability, and also UCD has a lot of climate work, and the law school with Andrew Jackson and Suzanne Kingston as well. But we're bringing out all these brilliant, leaders and thinkers and students coming out of these programs. And the reality is that they are facing massive burnout. They're going into these spaces, they are embodying what they're supposed to be doing, they're talking what they've learned, and they are getting, if not bullied, but kind of pushed out, because what they're saying is the reality, and that reality does not fit the style of economics that we have. So that's something as well that we have to, it's brilliant. It's kind of like this language I always hate as well about the younger generation. We'll teach them how to tackle climate change. And it's like, no, it's too late for that, and it's not fair, The reality is that we have to listen to what young people are saying now and implement it, and stop getting them to shoulder the burden, So making space for these people. Thank
Okay,
you.
we're gonna,
One more question
there's
right
one
behind
question here and one over there. So
Take both of them.
do you want to ask a question? Are you okay? Thank you.
That's very good.
Thank you for
Thank you.
having the maturity to say, no, it's okay. Is yours necessary, your question?
I wouldn't ask it if it wasn't. I'd like to ask Professor John Barry what his view of the efficacy of universal basic income would be in the new economy and in rethinking growth.
Very simple. I think we need universal basic income and universal basic services. So I think we might give our panelists one last quick round of, including Sharae, because you've been you want to say anything? So Amy, any last thoughts?
I think he wanted you to answer. Just delegate, that's the answer, obviously.
I'll just say, there was a little bit of discussion of sort of sacrifice and limits earlier. This is not on. Now it is. There was a bit of discussion about sacrifice and limits earlier, and I do think it's really important that if we're conceiving of post-growth, not to think about it in terms of giving up. We're already talking about the exhaustion that we have now, the suffering we have now, the kind of sacrifice zones that people are already put in. This is the realities we're already living in, and I do think that if we have a kind of a push for post-growth, we are talking about abundance, about more care, about increased healthcare and education, about increased public transport, about the increasing of housing for everyone, as well as ecological abundance and biodiversity and reconnection to the places where we are. Whether you're an immigrant like me, who was just naturalized last week, hooray, and doesn't have a deep place connection that is ancestral, because I wasn't born here and I don't have generations, I came in, but yet I can still have a sense of belonging and community and solidarity with the people where I am, but also solidarities with others across the world, international solidarities. And I think it's important to remember as well, in the midst of all the burnout and the exhaustion, the sense of joy and solidarity that can be had. I saw that so much with my students in the Palestinian encampment who at UCD who were successful, like the ones at Trinity. And they were also very environmental in their thinking. For them, they said, this justice issue in terms of Palestine was also a climate justice issue. And they had talks on environmental action going on almost every day as part of the encampment. And for them, they were saying, look, if we can achieve something here and we can feel the joy of organizing together and learning and doing something new and winning, of not having the bureaucratic apparatus of the institution of the university crushing us like we always feel like we are, if we can feel empowered and see that work, then we know that we can do this in other arenas. We can take this to climate justice. We can take this to housing. And I think it's important to retain a sense of the possibility and the joyful possibility, and not just the sense that we all feel of impotence and paralysis. So, hooray.
Excellent place to stop. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Could I ask everybody to give our panelists a round of applause again? Fantastic.